Hi everyone, welcome to Miss Adams Teaches The Great Gatsby. This video is taking a little look at chapter 2. We're going to be doing some analysis of character and theme, examining 4 or 5 key moments from the text. If you haven't read chapter 2 yet, please do so before you watch the video so that you know what we're talking about. And if you need any help here, have a little look at my playlist where you can see chapter by chapter readings just to make it a little bit easier for you at home. Let's get started. Okay, so chapter 2 opens up with a description of a new setting called the Valley of Ashes, which is a wasteland just on the way to New York. Nick and Tom Buchanan are actually heading into the city on a train, and as they pull up next to the Valley of Ashes, Tom demands that they get off because he wants Nick to meet his girl. This is Myrtle. So they go to Myrtle's home, which is a garage where she and her husband live, and Tom and Wilson, her husband, have a conversation about a car that he's planning on selling. After that conversation, Myrtle makes excuses. The three of them go into the city. She does a little bit of shopping before they go to their apartment, an apartment that Tom has secretly there just for him and Myrtle to use. Myrtle phones up her sister and some friends from the flat below, the McKees, so that they can all have a big party. And in that party, a whole lot of drinking happens. Even Nick, who is not normally one for alcohol. So as they drink more and more, it gets more heated, it gets more and more tense. And then in the end, Tom and his mistress Myrtle have a row about whether or not she is allowed to use Daisy's name or say Daisy's name. And he smacks her across the face, breaking her nose. It's a horribly brutal and graphic moment. That, funnily enough, ends that party, and Nick sort of stumbles home and kind of has a very hazy memory of how he got back. So let's begin by having a look at the description of the Valley of Ashes. So this is right at the very beginning of the chapter. It says, about halfway between West Egg and New York, the motor road hastily joins the railroad and runs beside it for a quarter of a mile so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. So desolate is our first sort of powerful adjective to consider. This is a valley of ashes, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens, where ashes take the forms of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally with a transcendent effort of ash-grey men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. Occasionally a line of grey cars crawls along an invisible track, gives out a ghastly creak and comes to rest, and immediately the ash-grey men swarm up with leaden spades and stir up an impenetrable cloud which screens their obscure operations from your sight. Oh, so beautifully written and just sort of such a devastating description. So have a little look at some of the ways that he creates this sense of bleakness in this area. So he calls it a fantastic farm. So this metaphor here, don't get confused by the word fantastic. It doesn't mean great. It means of fantasy, so unreal. A fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens. So this simile here is horribly ironic because he's using language to do with nature and growth, like fertility. Grow like wheat, but what is growing is ash. Ash, which of course connotes death. So we've got wonderful juxtaposition and irony created in this image. Ash takes the form of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and then ash-grey men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. So the repetition, obviously, of the word ash and different variations of it demonstrates the kind of scale of it, that you can't see anything but ash, and everything is made of ash, even the men. So men here seem lifeless, without hope, and they move dimly through the powdery air. They are crumbling. So this metaphor, these men are crumbling. They are made of ash. So it's like they're at the brink of destruction. The cars are also grey, the colour of ash, and they crawl Okay, so metaphor in this case, quite zoomorphic, but they're crawling along an invisible track. So it's like there's an inevitability of the direction. Things just keep on going, keep on churning, churning, churning. And then you've got these ash grey men, so again, that repetition, and they swarm up. So that metaphor is really kind of reminiscent of like insects, like gathering together. So really describing both the place and the people in a very, very similar way, without hope, without life, grey, crumbling, powdery. And then you get this really interesting contrast, because he says that above the grey land and the spasms of bleak dust, which drift endlessly over it, you perceive after a moment the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. Now, what he's describing here is like an old billboard sign. It's an advert. So obviously for someone who worked with eyes, like an optician. And these eyes are blue and gigantic. So you've got this sort of contrast to the grey, even though it's faded. There is no face, but they look out of a pair of enormous yellow spectacles. Evidently some wild wag of an oculist set them there to practice fatten his practice in the borough of Queens. So this is the reminder that this is, you know, someone trying to boost their business, but they have now sunk down into eternal blindness. So that metaphor there, the hyperbole, also ironic because he's talking about someone who is an oculist sinking into eternal blindness, but what that really means is the failure of his business, the failure of his dream, and that is kind of left there as a reminder. His eyes, dimmed a little by many paintless days under sun and rain, brood on over the solemn dumping ground. So this as a symbol is so dramatic, because you've got this idea of this grey, bleak place of suffering and death, and then you've got eyes looking down. So some people consider this as almost like a judgment, like God looking down. And if you think about the idea of eyes looking down on you, well, you can read that in a couple of ways as well. You can see that as some sort of protection, yeah, but you can also see it as being like a bystander, or, you know, someone looking but not seeing, you know, raining but not doing anything. So the fact that there are these bright, even if they're a little dimmed, but, you know, blue and yellow eyes looking down, it's also a reminder that no one is helping. They are being overlooked, yeah, not looked after. Fitzgerald wrote this in the mid-1920s, and in a couple of years prior to that, in 1922, a very, very famous poet called T.S. Eliot wrote an epic poem called The Wasteland, which also describes an area of land with absolutely no life. And it is fairly, people are fairly convinced that Fitzgerald was really, really influenced by this poem, and that actually this is a bit of an allusion to the wasteland. Have a little look at just this tiny little snippet of the poem. Okay, so this is just it in front of you. Just read from here. Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images, where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. You can so see it in Fitzgerald's writing, can't you? This idea of lifelessness and death permeating everything. And this is where Tom Buchanan's wife lives. Now, her husband, Wilson, is one of these grey men. He's described as being ashy, like a ghost, sort of anemic. Everything about him kind of fades into the wall. He is a product of this world of waste. Yeah, he is a product of this place that if you think about West Egg and East Egg and how they symbolize old money and new money, the wasteland is a symbol of the suffering of the lower classes, and that is where Wilson is. And then there's Myrtle. Let's look at some examples of how Nick views her, and you'll see what I mean by views. She was in the middle 30s and faintly stout, but she carried her flesh sensuously, as some women can. Her face, above a spotted dress of dark blue crepe de chine, contained no facet or gleam of beauty, but there was an immediately perceptible vitality about her, as if the nerves of her body were continually smouldering. She smiled slowly, and walking through her husband as if he were a ghost, shook hands with Tom, looking him flush in the eye. Okay, notice the way that she stands out from everything else in the Valley of Ashes. She is not grey, yeah? She is not grey. She's wearing a spotted blue dress, so that makes her stand out. And whereas all of the men and the descriptions of the landscape are about death, she has a perceptible vitality about her. She is alive. She is brimming with life. The way that Nick describes her, though, it's very, very physical. And you'll notice this about Nick. He likes a good look and a good physical description of a woman. But it's not very complimentary. She's faintly stout. So she's sort of, he describes her figure as thick as well in another moment. So she's faintly stout or thick. She has no facet or gleam of beauty. So she's a big-ish woman. She's unattractive facially. However, there is this description also that is very, very kind of sexual. Yeah, so you've got carried her flesh sensuously. So even though she's thick and stout, she moves with some sort of like sensuality. And then again, this perceptible vitality, as if the nerves of her body were continually smouldering. So, you know, a lovely simile here, but again, the word smouldering, a verb in this case, it's about fire, it's about passion. So again, there's this sort of sexualization of Myrtle here, and even her confidence. You know, she smiles slowly. I think at one point he remarks that she wets her lips, but she walks through her husband as if he were a ghost. So this simile here is demonstrating how different they are from each other, and yet she looks Tom flush in the eye. So there's a sign. Now Wilson doesn't know that this is happening, bless his little heart. So her physical appearance is dealt with here. Then, after they've left, we get another description of some of her physical appearance. So have a little look at this. She had changed her dress to a brown figured muslin, which stretched tight over her rather wide hips. So again, we've got another focus on physicality, her wide hips, really. Are we thinking about childbearing hips here? Possibly, yes. So a little bit more sort of sexualization. And we've got a dress change, and you'll see why that's important in a moment. Whilst they're out, we see the kind of change that starts to develop here in Myrtle's behaviour. At the newsstand, she bought a copy of Town Tattle and a moving picture magazine, and in the station drugstore, some cold cream and a small flask of perfume. It's got this listing here of all of the things that she buys. And she is obviously a woman without means herself. So when she's with Tom, she benefits from his financial position, and her behaviour changes to go with it. They also buy a dog in this moment. It's a perfect example of a kind of form of conspicuous consumption, this sort of buying for the sake of buying, this buying to show sense of self. Once they get into the apartment and the friends start to arrive, we have another costume change. So Mrs. Wilson had changed her costume. Again, note just the metaphor costume some time before, and was now attired in an elaborate afternoon dress of cream-coloured chiffon, which gave out a continual rustle as she swept about the room. So she's changed into an elaborate dress. So she is creating a persona for herself. She's trying to be someone of Tom's station, class-wise, and she's trying to present herself as elegant and fashionable, but it just doesn't quite work. Note the subtle differences. Okay, so in the earlier chapter where we met Daisy, she was wearing white and she was fluttering and rippling and ballooned. It all was very graceful. Whereas Myrtle is wearing cream-coloured, so off-white, and rather than fluttering and rippling around the room, she has a continual rustle that goes about her. So she doesn't fit in the kind of situation. So it's a real metaphor for this jarring attempt to be of Tom's station and failing. It then goes on to talk about how her personality undergoes a change, in shifting into impressive hauteur. Her laughter, her gestures, her assertions, nice little triad, became more violently affected moment by moment, and as she expanded, the room grew smaller around her until she seemed to be revolving on a noisy, creaking pivot through the smoky air. Just imagine that for a moment. It's like if Daisy is like this perfection, yeah, with her voice and her, everything's so lovely and charming, and so Daisy's like this perfection woman, and she is this lesser version. And where Daisy is put upon a pedestal by the men in her world, including Nick at this moment, Myrtle puts herself upon not a pedestal, but a noisy creaking pivot. So it's like she's trying to live up to being Daisy, but it's just not quite working. And you can see a similar kind of idea in their relationship. I mean, obviously, Tom and Daisy's relationship isn't great either because he's cheating on her. But there is at least a sort of, I don't know, there's a sense of love between them. Now, when you see the exchanges between Tom and Myrtle, I mean, they're painful. So have a little look at this moment. I'd like to do, so this is Mr. McKee from downstairs talking, he's the photographer. I'd like to do more work on Long Island if I could get the entry. All I ask is that they should give me a start. Ask Myrtle, said Tom, breaking into a short shout of laughter as Mrs. Wilson entered with a tray. She'll give you a letter of introduction, won't you, Myrtle? Do what? She asked, startled. You'll give McKee a letter of introduction to your husband so he can do some studies of him. His lips moved silently for a moment as he invented George B. Wilson at the gasoline pump or something like that. So he is directly mocking her in front of the guests. And it's not a little bit of light-hearted joking. He is mocking her for her lower class status. Yeah, so this idea about Myrtle will give you a letter of introduction. He's mocking her, he's mocking McKee, he's mocking Wilson, the studies of the husband. So it's a really, really unpleasant moment, and bless little Myrtle, she obviously just doesn't really understand. Another part of their relationship that is quite troubling is the story of how they met, which is in this little box here. So just have a little look. This is Myrtle telling Nick. It was on the two little seats facing each other that are always the last ones left on the train. He had on a dress suit and patent leather shoes. Okay, so she sees him, recognises that he's well-to-do. And I couldn't keep my eyes off him. But every time he looked at me, I had to pretend to be looking at the advertisement over his head because she recognises that it's not appropriate to be staring at a man on a train. So according to this, as far as Tom is concerned, she's not looking at him, she's looking at an advert. When we came into the station, he was next to me and his white shirt front pressed against my arm. And so I told him I'd have to call a policeman. But he knew I lied. I was so excited that when I got into a taxi with him, I didn't hardly know I was getting into a subway train. All I kept thinking about over and over was, you can't live forever. You can't live forever. What an unpleasant, non-consensual start to a relationship there. you can say, oh, it was this sort of passionate moment between two people that just knew, but actually no, not in this, well, not in any day and age. But the idea, if you just think the idea that she says to him, I'm going to call a policeman, and then he tells her that she was lying and that he could tell that he was lying. She's kind of taken on that narrative. But it sounds forceful, aggressive. And then the other tell is once she's finished telling the story, she turns to Mrs. McKee and the room rang full of her artificial laughter. So there's a kind of nervous behaviour here, and then this false laughter fills the room, and then this is the moment that she just completely changes subject. So we've got this relationship that is very forceful, aggressive. Tom is very much in control, in charge. He tells her what to say, think, do. He tells her what her thoughts are. And he has absolutely no respect for her. She is simply there as a sexual object. I mean, there's already earlier in the chapter, we know that the two of them have been off having sex in the room next door with, you know, Nick sort of sat there feeling uncomfortable. This is what her sole purpose is. And as a woman in the lower classes, she can't expect anything more, regardless of what lies Tom tells her. So another clear juxtaposition, between Daisy and Myrtle. Nick. Nick, we know from chapter 1, says that he reserves all judgments. That doesn't mean that he doesn't judge, but he doesn't act on them. And in this moment, this is an example, because he is in a flat with his cousin's husband and his cousin's husband's mistress, and he's sort of partying with them. There's something quite sort of sordid about this whole setup. And at various points, he talks about wanting to leave. And this is such a powerful moment in the chapter. He says, I wanted to get out and walk eastward towards the park through the soft twilight, but each time I tried to go, I became entangled in some wild, strident argument, which pulled me back as if with ropes into my chair. So it tells us something about the kind of what's happening to the party. It's getting heated. There are arguments. There's a kind of sense of chaos, and that in itself is keeping him there. You've got that simile about almost being trapped, tied to the chair. Yet, high over the city, our line of yellow windows must have contributed their share of human secrecy to the casual watcher in the darkening streets. And I saw him too, looking up and wondering. I was within and without, simultaneously enchanted and repelled by the inexhaustible variety of life. That is the money right there. So this description, highly symbolic, highly metaphorical. So imagine the building with the yellow windows, yellow because of the lights inside, contributing their share of human secrecy to the casual watcher. So imagine someone on the street casually looking up to the apartment blocks, seeing the yellow windows, seeing in and seeing this glimpse, this snapshot of this kind of behaviour. And in this case, it's this party. In another window, it could be anything else. So you've got the casual watcher stood on the street, looking and observing seeing in the window at the kind of crazy behaviour going on. And in that moment, as Nick thinks about this, he sees himself as the casual watcher. Yeah. So he, in his mind, is both an observer watching whilst at the same time being in the action, which is why he describes how he was within and without. He is both in the building in the moment, taking part, but he's also without because he's outside of it, a casual watcher observing. And I think that's how he makes peace with this whole idea about reserving judgments. Because if he's within and without, he's neither committed. He's not committed to either. And then this is shown in this juxtaposition here. He is simultaneously enchanted and repelled by the inexhaustible variety of life. So enchanted and repelled, within and without. He is both wanting to be there but horrified by it. And this is kind of Nick all over. And we see this idea of him being within and without all the way through the novel. So look out for that motif. Last point on Tom and Myrtle before we have a quick look at the strange ending of the chapter. This is obviously the kind of climax of the chapter and certainly the most shocking moment of the chapter. So sometime towards midnight, so that tells you something about how long they have been boozing for, bearing in mind that they were going into the city for lunch, so they have been boozing all day and night. Tom Buchanan and Mrs. Wilson stood face to face, so you imagine that sort of tension, discussing in impassioned voices whether Mrs. Wilson had any right to mention Daisy's name. Note how that is the argument. You don't have the right to even say her name. So this is again Tom reminding Daisy of her lower place, that her saying the word Daisy is an insult to Daisy, which of course means that Mrs. Wilson shouts, "Daisy, Daisy, Daisy. I'll say it whenever I want to." And halfway through her, whatever that is, fifth Daisy, making a short, deft movement, Tom Buchanan broke her nose with his open hand. Look at the way that this is given a paragraph to itself. Making a short, deft movement, Tom Buchanan broke her nose with his open hand. It's a complex sentence, but it's very concise, it's very precise, it's short and deft, just like the adjectives describing his movement, quick and to the point. The fact that Fitzgerald chooses to use the adjective deft, which of course means skilled, this suggests to us that Tom Buchanan has hit her before. Yeah, it's almost a natural reflex, and he breaks her nose. This is such a massive moment of conflict and violence. Again, nothing shows scorn more than a broken nose. But look what then happens after this precise and concise, neat little complex sentence. Look at the next paragraph. Then there were bloody towels upon the bathroom floor, and women's voices scolding, and high over the confusion a long broken wail of pain. Mr. McKee awoke from his doze and started in a daze towards the door. When he had gone halfway, he turned around and round, stared at the scene, his wife and Catherine scolding and consoling as they stumbled here and there among the crowded furniture with articles of aid, and the despairing figure on the couch bleeding fluently and trying to spread a copy of Town Tattle over the tapestry. So obviously a much longer paragraph, and then this incredibly long complex sentence here, and all of this is about the kind of chaos of the moment. But who isn't mentioned? Tom. Tom is not mentioned in this. There is no reaction, there is no response. There's very little real response from Nick or McKee, who just sort of quietly make their way out the door at this moment. You've got the women in this sort of chaotic scrambling around and calling and shouting and scolding. You've got poor Myrtle, who is a despairing figure, but look at this metaphor, bleeding fluently. So yes, so that suggests that there is a lot of blood issuing from her, but that adverb fluently, if you're fluent in something, it means that you can speak it perfectly, can't you? I.e. you've practiced. So it's another hint, it's another suggestion that this is a kind of normalized violence, that being punched by Tom is part and parcel of being with him. And then if you think about that in connection with their oh so romantic story of how they got together, it does start to create a rather alarming picture of domestic violence. And then after this dreadful scene, the chapter ends in a way that is most peculiar. McKee and Nick leave together in this moment, and there's this kind of ambiguous means uncertain, unclear, like deliberately vague. There is this sort of ambiguous moment in the lift where the elevator boy tells him off for touching the lever, and he's like, I didn't. And then suddenly we get this ellipsis, not my ellipsis, their ellipsis, Fitzgerald's ellipsis. I was standing beside his bed, and he was sitting up between the sheets, clad in his underwear, with a great portfolio in his hand. Beauty and the Beast, Loneliness, Old Grocery Horse, Brook and Bridge. Then I was lying half asleep in the cold lower level of the Pennsylvania station, staring at the Morning Tribune and waiting for the 4 o'clock train. So we have this kind of shift in time, this little skipping story marked out with the ellipsis showing these sort of like time lapses for Nick. But what does seem to have happened is he's gone down to the McKee's apartment with Mr. McKee, not with Mrs. McKee, because she's upstairs looking after Myrtle. And Mr. McKee has shown him his photography, but in his pants. Now, that might just mean that drunkenly he's got ready for bed and then shown him his photographs. But some people interpret this to be a moment of romance, that perhaps this is a sign of Nick's homosexuality, and especially when there is a kind of a metaphor under the surface about creativity and homosexuality that he kind of alluded to in chapter 1 as well, when he kind of made the point of saying that Gatsby wasn't creative. So what Fitzgerald is up to here, not quite certain. It's definitely possible, or it's a sign of just the kind of chaotic madness of the kind of drunken night, that it just stumbles from one scene to the next, regardless of how peculiar they are. Right, that's it from me. Hopefully it was helpful. Do let me know if you have any questions about the chapter or any comments. Just pop them in the comments line and I will get back to you. So all there is left to say is thank you so very much for watching and happy revising.